Good morning. Good morning for all of you who have joined us today. We're so glad that you're here and we're excited to be kicking off the NHLA Diversity Series. I'll introduce myself. My name is Nalandra Anselmo. I have a background in human resources. I'm currently coaching and consulting with an emphasis on personal development and building relationships. Michael Testagrossa will be joining us in just a moment. Well, let's go ahead and take a look at our agenda and what we'll be covering today. So today we are going into the what and the why of diversity and inclusion in the workplace. You'll hear us talk a lot about making a business case for diversity, and it really is laying a foundation for our future sessions in the series. So today we will look at just basic definitions. We'll define diversity, we'll look at inclusion and inclusive cultures, and why this would matter to an organization. So we'll look at potential improvements in your organization's performance and innovation. We'll look at building stronger teams and social collateral, and also how this could affect your bottom line. At the end of today's talk, we will go ahead and do a Q&A. We built in some time for that. And so if you would like to save your questions to the end of today, we'll go ahead and try to get to all of those at the end of the session. And then we will look at our next topics in the series. So diversity really is something that we all kind of have a handle on. We've been talking about this stuff in the workplace long enough to know what diversity is. Here's Michael. Michael, did you want to, I didn't know if you wanted to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Sorry, a little technical difficulty there. My name is Michael Testagrossa. I've been in the hospitality industry now for about 30 years in catering, convention services, and one of my penchants is for diversity training and also in cultural communication. So I'm very glad to join Nalandra today in our presentation.
Wonderful. So again, we'll get started on laying the foundation. The definition of diversity, we all kind of understand that, well, diversity is differences. Sure, it's the understanding that individuals in an organization are unique. For our discussion today, so that we get a shared understanding of what we mean when we're talking about diversity, it's not just the differences that people bring to the workplace. Really, it's this concept that we can use those differences as tools within our organization, as a positive contributing factor to enhancing our organization's culture, to influencing economic and social vitality, to help with innovation. And so these are the things that we're talking about when we say diversity. It's an understanding of the concept of what we can do with diversity. So we're also going to have a couple of polling questions today, and we'll pull up the first one. And this one we won't broadcast the results of, but we just would like to know if you are in a leadership position within your organization. So if you can impact your diversity and inclusion programs in your organizations, and you don't have to be a president or a diversity officer, just someone who has influence, who can actually have a say in policies and practices and programs around diversity in your organization. So we'll have you go ahead and vote. We'll go ahead and have you answer yes or no, and we'll use that for our course evaluation, and we'll also use that to guide our conversation today. We'll close that once we get all of our responses. Okay, so let's move on. We've said we understand what diversity is. It's differences. I guess what we'd like to also know is what kinds of differences we're looking at. And so when we have a discussion about diversity, today and in future sessions in the series, we actually will be talking about diversity in terms of two dimensions. So we obviously understand diversity to mean differences, and it's differences in things that we normally can see, these inherent traits such as gender, age, race, ethnicity, the things that are listed here. We call those the primary dimensions of diversity. And the reason we call them primary dimensions is really they're the things that get the most attention. And it's usually what we think of first. Like we said, it's the things that you can see. For our discussion, we also want to make sure we understand that there are other layers of diversity. When we look at the secondary dimensions of diversity, we're looking at things, as you can see, that are a little more readily changeable. They're not as apparent. Sometimes they're about experiences. Sometimes they're things that we choose. And so when we look at secondary dimensions of diversity, we have to include things that we might not always think about when we have a discussion about diversity. This really broadens our discussion. When we think of things like geography, for example, where you live in this country, a lot of times is going to determine lots about you. If you are from the South, you are going to have lots of different behaviors and maybe even values and customs than someone who is from New York City, for example. Have a different pace, you have a different way of speaking. So we have to understand that each of these, and this is not an exhaustive list, as you can imagine. We can add so many different things to this, diversity of thought, so many different ways to make decisions and communication styles. But each of these is its own culture. I'm looking at marital and parental status. Your married friends do things a lot differently than your single friends do. And those of you who are parents may have a different way of living than people who are without children. And so we have to understand that each of these really is in itself a culture. So when we're talking about diversity in the workplace, we don't want to stop at that first dimension. If we do, then we're missing out on an entire conversation about what diversity can mean. So for example, if we're looking at just those primary dimensions, I could look exactly like someone, have the same race and age and gender. I could have a twin, for example, but there would still be diversity between the two of us because of all the secondary dimensions that we would look at. So we want to make sure we understand that. Another thing we'd like to do here is differentiate our discussions between EEO, equal employment opportunity, and a discussion about having a diverse and inclusive workforce. So in the past, the discussion about diversity may have been, we need to talk about diversity so that we don't get accused of discriminating or so that we don't get sued. And when you look at diversity in that way, when you look at it from a compliance standpoint, the conversation feels different. There are various, state and federal and local laws that we must abide by that prohibit discrimination. And so this is where we get this external pressure to comply. It's mandatory, it's obligatory. But when we talk about having a diverse and inclusive culture, this is an entirely different conversation. This you do because within your culture, you believe it's the right thing to do. And so when it's voluntary, that means in order to make decisions around diversity and inclusion, you have to have a compelling argument to do that because I don't have to necessarily do it. As an organization, this has to come from within. And so many of our conversations in the past have been about having to sell this idea of having diverse and inclusive workforces. And so thus the business case for diversity was born.
So what I like to do is talk a little bit about statistics. I'm very analytical in nature, and to me, the numbers are what supports conversations. So previous conversations within organizations about diversity may have been difficult to have due to a variety of reasons. One of which may be the association with legal obligations. We're always afraid that if we don't do the right things, we're going to get into trouble. The conversation is becoming a little bit easier today, particularly because it is much more in the spotlight. And also our workforce is becoming much more diverse. The new generation of employees is more attuned to obstacles that diverse employees face, and job seekers expect it to be expect diversity to be a part of the conversation. So looking at just a couple of the statistics here on the screen um, from a few different surveys that we looked at, starting out with that millennials represent, so millennials 25 to 39 represent racial diversity more so than in the past. So if you look at 44% of millennials represent a diverse workforce compared to 28% of boomers. So that's almost twice as much. Minority groups will also make up a majority of the population by 2040. So particularly when we're talking about diversity, it's even more important as the different populations grow and have, rather than a minority, become closer to the majority. Another statistics I think is important. We look at heterosexual males younger than 45 are much more attuned to the obstacles of diversity. So why is this important? The importance of this is that typically when we're looking at leadership in organizations, it still is represented mostly by older white males. So the boomer generation or some of the X generation. And those are the people that are making the bigger decisions, signing the checks, and they also are not quite as savvy when we have that conversation on diversity. The last stat here, I think is also rather impactful. 67%, so that's almost about 2/3 of the job seekers expect diversity in the workforce. So the people that are entering into jobs are expecting our organizations to have some sort of diversity program in place. And I think that is much more common now. It's just making those programs a little bit more effective.
So diversity and inclusion, that discussion really is a way easier discussion to have. It's an easy sell because your employees are expecting it. And so we're going to talk today then about inclusive cultures, how to create inclusive cultures. And so in order to discuss inclusive cultures, we want to define inclusion and culture. So it's easy to create a diverse workplace. We've already said, if you want a diverse workforce, hire a bunch of different kinds of people to work for you, and you'll have a diverse workforce. What we want to say, though, is that if you don't create an environment that feels welcoming to those populations and that makes people feel like they want to do their best work, they will not stay. You won't be able to retain those employees. And so diversity is one thing. You get to check off the boxes and say, oh, wow, look at everyone that we have represented here. But now we have to figure out how to get people to stay. And we can see really in an example in the tech industry, for example, that is really struggling right now to keep women and people of color within the tech industry. Companies like Google and Microsoft and Amazon and Intel have pledged to figure out how to boost their diversity numbers. But I think there's another layer to this, and this is where inclusion comes in. Inclusion is the extent to which each person in an organization feels welcomed, respected, supported, and even valued as a member of the team. So in this environment, every employee tends to feel more engaged, and we've heard this term engagement time and again. Engagement is where your employees share the values of the organization, where they are invested, where they are highly satisfied and highly motivated. This is what inclusion leads to, and they're more likely to contribute toward business results. And so the conversation has to move from just checking boxes to creating an inclusive workforce. You cannot retain a workforce without this. And then let's talk about those cultures that you create. What's a culture? An organization's culture really is the beliefs and customs and knowledge and rules, all the things that are the language of a group. Understand that culture is the way that a company behaves, not the way that a company says they behave. We have to understand that it's what really goes down day to day that makes a culture. And so when we look at inclusion as a part of your culture, it has to be really baked into every single thing that you do. What do you celebrate? What is important? What kind of learning happens in your organization, and how are you developing people. It really does have to be from top to bottom in an organization and from the inside out. And it's not just that your employees feel this from inside your organization. People can actually see that from the outside looking in. And so there are lots of different kinds of cultures. If I asked you to think of an organization that has a culture of, being fun or quirky, probably an organization would come to mind. If I ask you to think of an organization that wants to be cutting edge and leaders in innovation and new products, you probably will think of an organization. And so in a minute, we'll talk about what it takes to become an organization that people associate with the idea of diversity and inclusion and highly engaged and performance-driven workplaces. When a culture is strong, you sense it, like I said, from within the organization and also from outside the organization.
So most companies start with a mission statement, a vision, and values. These are the key components, particularly when we're talking from a leadership perspective, on what defines the company and helps drive the culture. In an ideal situation, these are aligned with the day-to-day behaviors, practices, beliefs, etc., the actual culture of the organization. However, sometimes, and particularly the mission statement isn't necessarily going to come out and talk about diversity. It's usually somewhere in the vision and values. So if your organization's culture does not flow from one of these, there may be a disconnect in understanding diversity and inclusion, and also a lack of identity. Normally, it's a value statement that really helps drive and develop and support the culture of inclusivity. So we need to focus on changing the culture to cultivate inclusion through norms and practices, the written and unwritten rules. Some companies, and particularly lately, you'll see many companies have issued separate diversity and inclusion statements because they have not been represented already. Kind of going back to my focus on the statistics, Marriott, I think, has a great setup and is recognized for diversity, and this is their cultural diversity statement. So at Marriott, the foundation for diversity and inclusion is promoting unity in family. Through unity, we create an inclusive environment that supports recruitment, retention, and advancement of all employees, and actively engages in efforts to develop a diverse and inclusive workforce, owner, guest, and supplier base. So I think they get it as a company, and their culture is really designed around that. So I think it's a great example that many other companies can look at and follow to make sure that they are also in line. Next slide, I think, talks a little bit more about kind of the process. And as Nalendra and I were kind of hashing out the presentation for today, really it's kind of like the farming scenario. So you start out with, you need to cultivate diversity. So you need to prepare the foundations of your organization. So some of that is through those programs, the mission, vision, values, and make sure that you have that playing field and understanding of how to build your organization. You then need to focus on growing the culture to be inclusive. So as Nalendra talked about previously, is that you start out with diversity, and then you need to move on to inclusivity. And then finally, you can reap the benefits of inclusion. And shortly, we're going to be discussing a little bit more about that. But diversity and inclusion is also not a one-time thing, just like the scenario of the farm. You don't just plant one time and then it's like, okay, I'm done. It's all about constant revision, evaluation, and cultivate to continue to develop. So particularly, in the past 10 years from the diversity inclusion platform, we've seen a lot more newer issues come to light, or newer obstacles, or newer populations and elements of diversity that we need to focus on. It's also kind of like R&D. So you can't keep producing the same model and expecting it to meet the needs of a new generation of customers. And we've already talked about how the next generation is much more demanding. So we do need to constantly revisit to make sure that our current programs are effective.
So as Michael talked about cultivating and growth, what we're looking at now are the seeds. This is where you plant the seeds. You will see this model in our future discussions. This is the employee life cycle. And when we talk about developing inclusive work cultures, what would need to happen is you'd have to plant seeds really in every aspect of people management within your organization. So your diversity and inclusion programs need to be strategic. They need to be in alignment with your company's goals for the near future. So is your business strategy to improve the guest experience? Is it to introduce new products and improve innovation? Is it to increase your market share? If you're going to do that, you also want to make sure that you take into consideration diversity and inclusion and make those practices a part of your management day to day, micro and also macro on a strategic level. So for example, in attracting talent and recruiting talent, where are the sources? Where are you sourcing applicants? And are you going to the same places that you've always gone to find quality candidates? Or are you looking in places that might yield a more diverse workforce and better talent? Your onboarding process, even your orientation. Again, if employees, as we said before, don't feel welcome within your organization, you won't be able to retain them. And so we're looking at diversity and inclusion from every aspect. And then you design your programs and you put the right people in the right roles to oversee and to lead not just the performance of your organization and contributing to the bottom line, but also ensuring that diversity and inclusion are a part of everything that you do, if this is the kind of culture that you'd like to cultivate. So again, we'll go around this entire model. We'll give specifics on each of these areas in a future talk, but you want to make sure that you understand that these things not only need to be put into place, but there also has to be a way to measure them. And so when companies get it right, when they actually plant the seeds and then they can see the results, what do those results look like?
So I'm glad you asked about results.
What did it look like?
So again, I love the stats, and that's kind of what excites me, because I think numbers speak quite loudly and demonstrate really, again, our business case for diversity. So there's multiple studies which support the need for a diverse workforce and how it impacts productivity and innovation, both of which lead to revenue generation. And really, for me, from kind of the operations aspect, what's always been talked about is, we can't do things just because. We need to do it because it's going to have a financial impact. So I think that it's very important to talk about and the relevance. So we need to know that we're not just doing the right thing, and that's important, but when it contributes to the bottom line, and that's easier for us to then sell that to our stakeholders. A great quote that I found was from Telly Whitney, former CEO and president of Anita Borg Institute of Women in Technology. And she said, "Diversity drives innovation. When we limit who can contribute, we in turn limit what problems we can solve." And I think we want to make sure that our workforces are as innovative, as competitive as possible to keep up and to keep relevant. So if you just, excuse me, focus on the statistics here. So 26% represents the average innovation revenue reported by companies that have below average scores in diversity. However, almost twice as much is reported by those companies that have above average scores of diversity. So it's pretty representative here of where we need to be with regard to the inclusion process. The next one goes into it a little bit more and some additional statistics. So in 2025, 75% of the global workforce will be made up of millennials. And I know some of the older workers and leaders that I've talked to are kind of have mixed reviews on that, but I think it's a great opportunity for us, particularly because they have different ways of thinking. And again, they represent diversity. So as you see here, 74% of millennials believe that their inclusive organizations are more innovative. And then supported by that, 84% of the executives say that innovation is essential for business growth. So the statistics do support that innovation is important and that needs to be our focus. Furthermore, then 69% of executives believe that diversity and inclusion are most important values and issues at hand. So we see the trend and moving in that direction, and at least there's an awareness of it. And then basically diverse teams are 87% better at making decisions rather than individuals. So really we do have a strong case for it to showcase the relevance and importance of including diversity into the mix. A couple other things to think about as well. You know, the hospitality industry is really all about innovation. We look to renovate our rooms, either do soft renovations or full renovations, you know, every 5 to 7 years. Las Vegas in particular, you know, is definitely very forward in the amount of newness that we offer. And we're constantly rethinking and redeveloping what we offer to make sure that we're cutting edge and giving our guests reasons to come back, along, of course, with the high levels of service. So what we want to think about is if you continue to hire the same people with the same perspectives and backgrounds, you're going to get the same outcomes. For instance, a good example, if you only hire Cornell graduates, while you're going to get a great group of educated people, they're only going to have the Cornell experience. So you want to make sure that we offer more diverse thoughts and different perspectives.
Just like Michael said, if you take a project or a problem and you put it in front of a primarily homogeneous group, meaning they have maybe the same background, the same age, the same gender, the same education, the same this or that, you know, pick whatever diverse aspect you want to pick. But either way, if it's all the same, you know, how many different solutions to that problem are you really going to get? If you put that same problem in front of a more diverse group, think about the different perspectives that you'll see. Think about the different lenses that people will come from and the different amounts of input. So when we think about it in those terms, projects, problem solving, innovation, it makes a lot of sense. Or if we just look backwards to when this wasn't necessarily a goal in organizations. Think about this, the first airbags that were developed actually put women and children at risk. And why was that? Because those airbags were tested on men. They were tested on men. And so here they were, you know, at the automaker, you know, they've got these airbags and, you know, the lead guy in charge is going, wow, that airbag really works great. Did it work for you? You know, he looks to his left and says, did it work for you? And the guy on the left says, yeah, it worked for me. And then he looks to his right and he says, did it work for you? And the guy on the right says, sure, it worked for me. And he goes, yeah, it worked for me too. So it must work. Let's put it out. But what we're forgetting is about that idea of a diverse perspective. And so that's what we're missing when we don't consider diversity. Lots of other examples of this. A few years back, a group of developers at YouTube, they developed apps that actually downloaded videos upside down for about 5 to 10% of the population. Because that app was designed by right-handed developers. So when they all turned their phone to the side, video worked just fine. But if somebody put that phone in their other hand and flipped it, the video would be upside down, but nobody considered that. But again, lots of examples of this. Speech recognition doesn't work for higher pitched voices or voices with accents. And so as we become more and more diverse, it would make sense to figure out how to include everyone. And this is where we talk about inclusion. So we do have another poll question. We'll go ahead and put that up for you now. And this one is just asking you to think about your own organizational culture. And so we're going to ask you, do you feel that your company culture supports inclusivity or inclusion, meaning in its practices? And again, we will not, are we going to broadcast these?
Yes.
Yeah, let's go ahead and see we'll go ahead and see the results of these. So once everyone puts their responses in, we'll see what we've got here. Do you feel your company culture supports inclusivity or inclusion?
So while you're taking that, I'll bring up also, in Las Vegas in particular, there's a couple examples as well about where diverse thoughts were not incorporated. A classic one is the MGM, the original design. So when it was first designed, and the new location, not the original one, the entrance was through a lion's mouth. And as you are probably aware, the lion's mouth is no longer there. By 1998, this entrance was removed because reports that many Chinese gambling guests refused to enter because it was considered bad luck in the culture. So again, from a design perspective, they obviously were not considering and really incorporating different perspectives, and particularly from a cultural aspect. So to share the poll results, so 80% of you said yes, you do feel that your company culture supports inclusivity. So I think that's great. Nobody said no, so that's good as well. And 20% indicated that they were unsure. So again, it's just, there's still definitely opportunities to build upon.
So as we round out our discussion on performance and innovation, really the heart of the business case for diversity.
Just transitioning here. So again, statistics I think are great. So when we talk about performance, innovation, and market share, first one, when performance, companies that exhibit gender diversity are 21% more likely to outperform those that don't. And those that represent ethnic diversity are 33% more likely to outperform those that don't. So particularly when we're thinking about it from a competitive standpoint, it's important to consider then who is really involved in the process and making sure that we have a good representation. Innovation, again, we've talked about that a little bit. So companies who listen to diverse voices are nearly twice as likely to unleash value-driving insights. And I think that's something you can bring to the bank. The last one I think is also quite relevant because again, we need to think about it, is how this impacts our bottom line and really helps our business grow. Companies with the most diverse teams are 45% more likely to grow market share year over year, and 70% more likely to capture new markets. And to me, that again is hugely impactful and something that you can bring to a leadership team and stakeholders in support of diversity and inclusion. But here's the caveat to this. So we've talked a little bit about diversity and building the team. We talked about inclusion and creating engagement, but really we haven't touched upon yet the most important aspect of it, and that's equity. So I came up with an example of, you can invite your guests to join you for dinner, and then you can, which is diversity. So your guests are at the dinner party. Inclusion is when you invite the guests to sit at the table with you. Equity is when we allow our guests to actually speak at the table and allow their voices to be heard. And I'm sure some of you can equate that to family dinners or a variety of other situations where you were present at the table, However, you weren't necessarily valued or listened to. And I think that that is the key component to really transforming our diversity inclusion programs and making sure that we're not just, again, we're not checking boxes, we're not just creating these programs, but we're really listening and allowing representation. So it's great if you have diversity. However, if your diversity is tucked away in your housekeeping departments or your stewarding departments, that's doing nothing for your organization. Inclusion is getting people involved and giving them kind of more of a position throughout your company. And it's important that we have diversity representation in every department to gain those different perspectives and capitalize on the opportunities for innovation. And then again, for equity. So you either need to have people of diversity in leadership positions, or you need to have strong leaders that understand and appreciate the importance of inclusion and representing those voices.
So we have a new polling question. We have another polling question before we go on to this one. That's okay. We're going to leave that up. Do you feel that your company offers equal representation and voice for the team members, for all team members within your organization? So do you feel your company offers equal representation, a voice at the table, not just being invited to the party, but a voice at the table? So we'll have you go ahead and mark yes or no or unsure. We're going to go ahead and broadcast those results as well. Okay, so we have 63% of us say yes for organizations, 13% no, and then some of us are unsure. Okay. Interesting. And so at least we know what direction we want to be headed. We know what direction the horse is going. So we'll just ride it that way. Companies that get it focus on diversity, inclusion, and equity. And when they do that and it's done properly, you're able to attract the best and brightest talent. Your work teams are functioning at high levels. You enjoy a wonderful reputation, not just with job seekers, but also out from outside of your organization. And this makes you an employer of choice. So this is a list from earlier this year of characteristics of organizations that would make them an employer of choice. And what I'll say is you can tie diversity, inclusion, and equity to each one of these, to all of these. I'll just look down the right side here, involvement. We were talking about that really is inclusion. Positive relationships with coworkers, that's about your culture. Work-life balance, that's going to help people of different family status, different age. So now we're looking at those primary dimensions of diversity. A performance culture, that's about innovation. Fairness, that is equity, and recognition, you know, what gets celebrated and who gets celebrated and who gets to move forward and advance and enjoy the spotlight within your organization. So that's just one side of this list. So what we're looking at is if you are an employer of choice, then you are able to, like I said, reap the benefits from inside your organization and from without. If you have that enhanced reputation, then what you're doing is building social collateral in your organization. And this is Michael's area of expertise. And he'll talk to you more about that today and in future sessions. But if you can do it, it's not only from within your organization, it's from outside your organization. And this is where the dollar signs start to come up. We talk about the business case for diversity. That's what's going to happen.
So now that we have equity in our workforce and become the employer of choice and acquired that social collateral, you're positioned to be attractive to new and diverse markets. And I think, again, that's the logical progression and really what we want to have as our outcomes. So customers in diverse cultures have different values, expectations, and ways of communicating, and diverse consumer behaviors. Diverse markets are also more likely to buy from businesses that are representative of and support their culture, both internally and in the community. So if they see that you're doing the right thing and you're representative, and they hear good stories about you in the media and from other employees, they know that, okay, you're that somebody that they want to do business with.
Yeah, additionally, people want to spend their money at a place where they feel the company gets them. For whatever that is. And sometimes that is simply that I go to that company or that store or that business because somebody looks like me. And this is where a company speaks your language, literally and figuratively. You know, a lot of my female friends like to spend their money and do business with women-owned businesses. It's a great example of that.
So when we talk about the revenue potential from diverse markets, I think it's, again, great to look at some of the statistics. So the travel industry represents $218 billion. And in 2019, minority spending power, so Black, Asian, Hispanic, and Native American, was 3.9 trillion. And the LGBTQ community had a spending power of 3.7 trillion. So it's really important to understand our opportunities to tap into these markets. And again, it all links back to diversity and inclusion, because if you're doing the right things as a business, you become more attractive to the populations that you're inclusive of. Conversely, and I mean, we've seen that as well, where businesses don't focus on that or even have policies that are exclusive, then that could be detrimental to their business. I think there's some other interesting stats. So if you go to the LBCVA and look at the representation of three major metropolitan areas, so Las Vegas, Mesquite, and Laughlin, and number of visitors. So the number of visitors to each of those ranges between 70 and 87% representative of Caucasian or white guests. So that leaves us about 25% for diversity. And kind of going back to what we were talking about previously, that our population is becoming more diverse. We're leaving a lot of money on the table. So for instance, for Las Vegas, only 9% of the visitors are Black. In Mesquite, only 3%, and in Laughlin, only 8%. So we want to look at it, and particularly if we're really looking to engage and appeal to a variety of markets, which we all are, you know, particularly now, we need to reconsider how we're putting our name out there. We need to think about how our image in the community is perceived and how our diversity and inclusion and equity can be a game changer from a financial perspective.
Right. And so, you know, as we answer the question, why do you as an organization need diversity and inclusion and equity now, you know, the first answer would be, for a lot of organizations, you really can't afford to not take a look at diversity and inclusion and equity in your organization at this stage of the game. Like we said earlier, it may have been a hard sell. That business case for diversity, because it's all voluntary, may have been a hard sell in the past. But as we look toward the future, not only is it an easy sell, it's actually a no-brainer. So the potential benefits, the potential benefits really of creating a diverse and inclusive workforce is diversity supports innovation and productivity, the foundation of the business case. You can become an employer of choice, and this means you have your pick of the best talent. Your business then gains social collateral, which can mean lots of different things for your organization, including attracting diverse markets. And all of this, again, contributes to your bottom line. Michael, did you have anything to add to that before we move to our Q&A?
I think we're great. You summed it up quite well.
Thank you so much. I just read what was on the slide.
Yeah.
So. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and open it up for some questions, and we'll see if we can answer what you have here. Once we're done with our Q&A, and we have plenty of time for that, we'll just go over what we will discuss in our next sessions in the series. So we hope you'll join us for those. But I think this one is a good foundation. We laid a pretty good foundation for the business case, and then we just go forward from here.
Any questions? You can type them.
Let's see. Thank you. Not a question, a comment. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us today. All right, so we'll leave a little time to type because sometimes typing takes a while. And let's see, we'll go ahead and move forward to our review of what's up next, and then we'll come back and see if we have any questions. So again, thanks for joining us today. Our next topics in the series are on October 14th. We'll look at 7 tips for creating a more inclusive workforce. In this session, we will actually focus on building, really the steps for building diversity and inclusion programs and equity within your organization. We'll take a look again at that employee life cycle and put some meat on those bones and make sure that you walk away with things that you can actually use really by the time we're done with the session, things that you can actually introduce into your organizations to get going. And then on October 21st, as we continue the series, we'll look at unmasking unconscious bias. And this one we will look specifically at individual behaviors, organizational behaviors, systemic exclusion and bias. So that ought to be interesting. We may have a lot more polling questions for you on that one. Oh, and then we have some other topics, I guess, that we didn't make it into this series, but we want to go ahead and highlight those. Like we said, our marketing expert, Michael, can walk us through marketing to diverse target markets. We talk about cultural communications. We talk about inclusion policies, kind of that HR nuts and bolts of inclusion within your workplace. So all things that, that we love to talk about. All right, I'm gonna look one more time for questions. We do have a question, wonderful. We do? Maybe not. The chat. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. Which one of 3 do you think businesses should focus more on in today's climate? Okay, we're gonna say I'm gonna go 1, 2, 3, and then we'll each say our answer, what we think it is. Together? 1, 2, 3. Equity. Okay, very good. For sure, equity. The other 2 just really don't have enough teeth. Again, diversity is one thing, inviting people to show up. Inclusion programs, that's another thing. Equity is where we actually get the full benefit of diverse voices within our organization. And not only that, I believe that it sets a good example for social responsibility in your organization as well. But again, that's another conversation.
Yeah, and I think it's, you can't really jump to equity. So I don't think it's just like doing that alone. You definitely need to have diversity and inclusion started. And I think, again, most organizations, I would say a majority of the organizations are already looking at diversity and have diversity programs. I was looking at some stats yesterday, and I think it said about 95% have some sort of diversity statement or program. Inclusion, again, is the next step, but really now we're focusing on the equity, because you can't have innovation if you're not listening to the diverse voices.
Thank you for that question. We appreciate it. Any others? Any other questions? We do want to ask everyone, invite you to complete an evaluation for today's session. And so we'll go ahead and put that information up. Again, continue. If you have other questions, feel free to type those in. I'm just going to make sure that we get to a place where we can give you access to our post-session survey. So if you have your device, maybe your phone, your tablet, you can just go ahead and scan there. That'll take you right into our course evaluation. We would greatly appreciate your feedback on today's topic and today's discussion. And you can also contact us if you have questions outside of the session. You can email us at info@diversityinclusionequity.com. Those are dashes in between there, by the way. So we're going to leave the QR code up just for a little bit longer so that we can hopefully get as many responses to our post-session survey, our evaluation. All right, and if there are no other questions, Michael, did you have anything else?
I don't. Thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Thank you for joining me, Michael. It was my pleasure. Had a wonderful time.
And we hope you all join us next week for our next step in the conversation.
7 steps, put it on your calendar. Thanks.